From one fighter who let his hothead get the best of him, to another who was a little too fond of the devil's lettuce. These are the MMA fighters that were banned from the UFC for life. As we all know, the sport of mixed martial arts can be a cutthroat industry, with fighters regularly being signed and cut from promotions following less than impressive performances. And when it comes to MMA promotions, no organization is more famous or successful than the UFC. Especially in its early days, the premier promotion was notorious for cutting fighters after a string of losses. More often than not, they adopted a 3 strikes policy. But losing a couple fights isn't the only way to get yourself cut from the world's biggest MMA promotion. Just ask Paul Semtex Daly. Ahead of UFC 113, where the British fighter was set to face Josh Koscheck, tensions were running high, and a lot of insults were thrown back and forth. It was clear that the two had absolutely no love for each other, and when the bell rang in Montreal back in 2010, they were at each other's throats.
Let's go fight! 3 5-minute rounds, and here we go!
Use those fakes, Paul. Switch up the hands. Hands are high.
Unfortunately for Paul, Josh managed to use his superior grappling to dominate his opponent for the majority of the fight. Paul simply couldn't find a chance to land the left hand he so desperately wanted to throw, except after the bell. Seconds after the end of the 3rd round, Daly seemingly wasn't satisfied with how the fight played out, and sucker punched his opponent before the ref quickly jumped in. In all fairness to Koscheck, he was pretty cool about the whole thing, chuckling as he went back to his corner before they came out again and he was declared the winner, which was clear for everyone to see by unanimous decision. Now, it's pretty obvious that Daly was frustrated that the fight hadn't gone his way, and in the heat of the moment he decided to do a stupid thing. But unfortunately for him, the president of the UFC, Dana White, wasn't too understanding of the fighter, later telling reporters at the post-fight press conference that Paul Daly was never fighting in the UFC again. He even doubled down, saying that he didn't care if Daly turned out to be the best pound-for-pound fighter in the world. He'd never fight for his promotion again.
I don't give a shit if he's the best 170-pounder in the world. He'll never come back here again.
We're talking Paul Daly.
Yeah.
You're cutting him from the UFC.
Yeah. He'll never come back. I'm probably the most lenient guy.
Now, Paul did go on to have a successful career in Bellator, but it's a shame that we, the fans, didn't get to see his talent grow in the UFC, all because he couldn't keep it together. Now, while sucker punching your opponent is pretty obviously gonna get you in trouble, a lot of fighters have been hounded by PED controversies, and still had long illustrious careers in the UFC. Other fighters haven't been so lucky. Take Ruslan Magomedov. The 36-year-old Russian fighter is unique on this list, as he was the first fighter ever to be handed a lifetime ban not from the UFC itself, but from USADA, the United States Anti-Doping Agency. Ruslan signed to the UFC in 2014, and fighting in the heavyweight division, he was shaping up to be a real contender. Currently, his professional record stands at 15 wins and 3 losses, but we'll never get to know this fighter's true potential, as in 2016, he was handed a 2-year suspension following a drug test where he tested positive for banned substances associated with muscle growth. Little did he know, Ruslan would never fight in the UFC again, as in 2018, he failed another random drug test, and in early 2019, he was handed a lifetime ban from USADA after he refused to submit a sample. Now, don't feel too sorry for the guy. His failed drug tests indicate that Magomedov was probably cheating, but it's hard to justify the harsh ban he's received considering that other fan favorites such as John Jones have had successful careers mired in steroid controversy. But Ruslan isn't the only fighter to receive a harsh punishment for transgressions against USADA. UFC legend Wanderlei Silva also received a pretty harsh treatment after a run-in with the Nevada State Athletic Commission. Back in 2014, Wanderlei was scheduled to fight Chael Sonnen at UFC 175. But not only did he fail to submit an application to fight in the state of Nevada, Silva also refused to undergo a mandatory drug test. In fact, reports allege that he literally ran away from the official who was sent out to test him. Following the incident, Dana White commented on the situation, saying, "Nobody has ever run from a drug test before. I didn't see a life ban coming. Nobody will let him fight. He's in a very serious situation. There's going to be no Hall of Fame. The guy's been Pete Rosed. There's going to be no Hall of Fame offers." Oof. Pretty harsh words from the president of the UFC there. Following both offenses, Dana afforded Silva a $70,000 fine, releasing him from his contract never to return to the promotion again. To be fair to Silva, at the time, random drug testing was a relatively new phenomena in the sport. And in an appearance on the popular podcast, The Joe Rogan Experience, Silva's rival Chael Sonnen expressed some sympathy for his fellow fighter's troubles. Sadly, that hasn't changed the fact that Vanderlei has never fought in the UFC since.
With their fists, their feet, and Chael Sonnen, Vanderlei Silva, grudge match years in the making, no surprise, Sonnen exploding for the takedown, and he gets...
Now, failing some drug tests seems like a pretty inconsequential incident compared with what got this next fighter banned from the biggest MMA promotion in the world. Thiago Silva fought in the light heavyweight division of the UFC after making his debut in the promotion back in 2007. But only 7 years later, the Brazilian would be banned from the organization due to some pretty serious accusations. In 2014, Silva was arrested at his home in Florida and charged with aggravated battery, following an incident where he allegedly threatened his estranged wife with a gun, and ended up in a 4-hour standoff with a SWAT team before he was eventually surrendered. After news of his arrest broke, Dana White understandably told the press that Silva would never fight in the UFC again. Despite this promise, Silva was re-signed after the charges were dropped. But when audio emerged seemingly confirming his guilt, Thiago was dropped again, this time for good. Now, while most fans would agree that banning Silva from the UFC was the right move, there's one fighter whose banning has caused outrage among fight fans everywhere. I'm talking about none other than Nick Diaz. The California native and fan favorite was banned back in 2015 after testing positive for an illegal substance for the third time. The only problem is, Nick didn't test positive for any PED, but for marijuana, a recreational substance that is now legal in many states across the US. Following the positive test, Nick was handed a 5-year suspension from the Nevada State Athletic Commission, as well as a $165,000 fine. And as if that wasn't enough, Dana White handed him a lifetime ban from the UFC, a harsh punishment which many fans feel was a robbery of this talented fighter's prime years in the sport. While it seems the ban was later lifted, as fans got to see Nick in the octagon one last time at UFC 266 in 2021.
Very long.
Yes, the way he throws those.
Yes, it just studs at the end.
Both guys landing in there.
Yeah, they're both landing in there.
It's unfortunate that we missed the fighter's best years. Well, there you have it, folks. There seems to be an array of things you can do to end up in the UFC's bad books, and losing too many fights in a row doesn't seem to be the highest transgression on that list. So from one fighter who let his hot head get the best of him, to another who was a little too fond of the devil's lettuce, those were the MMA fighters that were banned from the UFC for life.